This was the plan all along. Bitcoin Core version 30 was all about creating an altcoin for Citrea. And by the end of this video, you'll understand most of the story. There's a lot to cover here, so let's get into it. I'll provide a list of sources for the claims made in this video in the description. If I get anything wrong, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. So a few days ago, on May 4th, 2026, a company called Citrea launched a governance token called CTR. It has 10 billion fixed supply, it's an ERC20 token, vote escrow staking model, 50 million plus in liquidity commitments from Galaxy Digital and other asset managers. Coinbase is already evaluating it for listing. If none of that sounds like Bitcoin to you, you're right. It's an altcoin. But here's the thing. About a year ago, I made a video about how Bitcoin Core developers were removing the op return data limits and how the whole process felt wrong. It's called Bitcoin Core Betrayed the Community. You can go look it up. I'll provide a link. The community was overwhelmingly against this change. Critics were getting banned from GitHub for speaking up, and Core pushed it through anyway. At the time, Citrea was named repeatedly as the company that stood to benefit the most from that change. A lot of people, myself included, said this had nothing to do with improving Bitcoin because it didn't make sense, there was no need for it, and had everything to do with enabling outside corporate products or something of that nature. It had to be. We were all told we were wrong, that it was about censorship resistance, harm reduction, technical best practice, blah, blah, blah. Well, Citrea just launched their altcoin, so let's talk about what actually happened. For anyone who didn't see my original video or wasn't following this debate, here's the short version. Op return is a feature in Bitcoin's code that allows small amounts of non-monetary data to be embedded in transactions. It was introduced in 2014 with an 80-byte limit, and it was explicitly described at the time as a harm reduction measure. It was never an endorsement of storing data, non-monetary data, on Bitcoin, on-chain. It was a way to contain something that was already happening by making it prunable so nodes wouldn't have to carry it forever. That 80-byte cap served as a deterrent. You could store a tiny piece of data, but you weren't going to be uploading images or running applications through it. Then in early 2025, a pull request appeared on the Bitcoin Core GitHub. It's called PR32359. It was submitted by Peter Todd at the request of Chaincode Labs developer Antoine Poinsot. The proposal raised the op return limit from 83 bytes to nearly 4 megabytes. In the original version, they also wanted to remove node operators' ability to configure this limit themselves. And that last part is a direct attack on self-sovereignty. Completely goes against the ethos of Bitcoin, telling node runners they couldn't choose their own mempool policies. Todd admitted the motivation publicly. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he was asked to open the PR because entities like Citrea were already writing data to unprunable outputs, the UTXO set, because the op return limit was too small for their data packets. Citrea needed about 100 bytes per operation. So rather than pushing back on Citrea for bloating Bitcoin's permanent data set, Core decided to make it easier for them. The backlash was immediate and intense. Ocean Mining's Bitcoin mechanic accused Core developers of colluding with Citrea to facilitate what he called spam on the blockchain. He pointed out that the changes were needed to increase the financial viability of Citrea's product and that those costs would be shifted to regular Bitcoin users. Obviously, Luke Dashjr and other developers pushed back hard. The hashtag fixed the filters spread across social media. Critics were banned from the GitHub discussion for voicing any opposition. And Jameson Lopp, the founder of Casa, who's also an investor in Citrea, was one of the most vocal advocates for this change. When people called out the obvious conflict of interest, he denied it, saying Citrea's bridge doesn't use op return for normal operations, only for fraud challenges that would, in his own words, likely never even occur. And despite all of this, Bitcoin Core v30 shipped in October 2025 with the op return limit removed. The community said no. Core said, and I'm just quoting the sentiment here, they said just fork or go fork yourself. And this is a big part of why Bitcoin knots went from about 5% of all nodes to about 22% by early 2026, as I've covered in my newsletter before. So now let's look at what all of this has enabled. Citrea is a ZK rollup, which stands for Zero Knowledge Rollup. It's built by a company called Chainway Labs, and it uses zero knowledge proofs to run smart contracts and EVM compatible apps on top of Bitcoin's block space. It settles back to Bitcoin for security, but the activity itself is a full DeFi ecosystem. Mainnet launched January 28th, 26. The investors include Peter Thiel's Founders Fund, Galaxy Ventures, Delphi Digital, Eric Voorhees, Balaji Srinivasan, and yes, Jameson Lopp. 16.7 million raised across 2 funding rounds. Here's what the platform supports: altcoin exchanges, DAOs, oracles, yield-bearing stablecoins, lending and borrowing products, 30 plus so-called Bitcoin native applications. They also launched CTUSD, a stablecoin issued by MoonPay and backed by short-term US Treasuries. They're positioning it as the foundational liquidity layer for the entire ecosystem. Here's a number that should concern you. On testnet alone, Citrea's data availability usage reached nearly 10% of Bitcoin's monthly bandwidth. A single project consuming a meaningful share of Bitcoin's limited block space for non-monetary data. Then, as of May 4th, the CTR token, 12% allocated to Genesis airdrop, 25% to a governance treasury, vote escrow staking where you lock tokens for voting power, 50% penalty if you try to unstake instantly, 40% reserved for investors and early contributors, locked for 4 years. Galaxy Digital has committed $50 million in liquidity. Coinbase is looking at listing it. And let me be clear about what we're looking at. It's a governance token for an altcoin ecosystem, staking yield DeFi DAOs built on top of Bitcoin's block space, enabled by a change that Core pushed through over the objections of a large portion of the community. And let me lay this out simply as I can. A year ago, people said this opportune change is being driven by corporate interests. Citrea and BitVM related projects need more data capacity on Bitcoin to make their products viable. Seemed obvious at the time. Core is serving them, not the community. That's what we all said. Core denied it, Lopp denied it. They called it a principled stand about censorship resistance and reducing harm to the UTXO set. But here's the timeline. Todd admits he opened the PR because Citrea-type entities needed more than 83 bytes. Core pushes the change through despite massive opposition. Citrea launches mainnet within a few months. Then they launch a stablecoin. Then they launch a governance token with tens of millions in VC liquidity behind it. Bitcoin's block space is being consumed by this ecosystem's data. To be fair, let me present the other side. Lopp's argument is that Citrea's bridge doesn't technically use large op returns for normal operations, only for rare fraud challenges. And core devs say the change was about aligning relay policy with what miners were already accepting, not about favoring any specific project. But those arguments look a bit hollow when you look at the broader picture. The BitVM infrastructure that Citrea depends on absolutely benefits from larger data commitments. The testnet bandwidth usage speaks for itself. And the entire purpose of Citrea's rollup architecture is to use Bitcoin's block space for non-monetary computation. The deeper issue, and I think even more important one, is about governance. Bitcoin Core developers pushed through a controversial change despite obvious community opposition. They did not care what anyone thought. They banned critics. They moved discussions out of public view. They told people who disagreed to just go fork the software. Go fork yourself. If you've been reading the newsletter, that should sound familiar. I once wrote a letter to my state senator about online poker being outlawed, explaining that it was a game of skill. And her response was basically, "We disagree, so your opinion doesn't matter. Go pound sand." It's the same energy. People in positions of influence ignoring the people they claim to serve. The difference is that in Bitcoin, we actually have recourse. We can run different software. We can choose knots or Bitcoin Commons or whatever implementation aligns with our values. That is the beauty of the system. It doesn't require anyone's permission, and we don't have to sit here and fight about it all the time. We can just run what node software we want. This isn't just about Citrea, it's about a pattern. I've talked before about the ways that powerful interests attack or co-opt things that threaten the status quo. Rhetoric, divide and conquer, and sometimes something even more subtle, capturing the process itself. Just look at who's involved. Citrea has VC money from Founders Fund, Galaxy, and others. The Stacks Foundation put up $500,000 for a BitVM security working group. Taproot Wizards pushed for inscription-friendly changes. Investors in these projects are also among the loudest voices advocating for the code changes that benefit them. These are venture capital-funded entities with financial incentives that don't align with the average person using Bitcoin to save, transact, or protect their wealth. And that's exactly why the growth of Bitcoin knots matters. When the people maintaining the reference implementation stop listening to the community needs to route around them. Knots going from 5% to 22% is the market speaking. That's anarchy working as intended. For what it's worth, I currently run Core version 29, and I'm waiting for the Bitcoin Commons software that Gil Roberts and Josh Secure Sovereign discussed on my podcast earlier this year. When that's ready for my Umbro setup, I'll be switching over immediately. If you haven't heard that episode, I'll link to it in the description. It's very important. The point is, you have choices. Your choice of node software is your most direct form of participation in Bitcoin's governance. It's more meaningful than any vote you'll ever cast in an election because it's not filtered through a representative. It is direct. Now, I don't take pleasure in being right about this. I wish I was wrong, but this is what happens when a small group of devs with VC connections prioritize corporate products over the community's input. The opportune change was not about making Bitcoin better, it was about making a specific product viable. And now that product has a token, a stablecoin, a DeFi ecosystem, and 50 million in institutional liquidity. Bitcoin will survive this. It always does. The network adapts, community responds, and the system corrects. But it requires vigilance. It requires running your own node, choosing your own software, and paying attention. If you're holding Bitcoin and you haven't set up a node yet, it's definitely time to make that a priority. This is the number one most important thing happening in Bitcoin right now and in a number of years, and will continue to be for some time going forward. So I hope everyone realizes the gravity of this situation, because those of us who believe Bitcoin is money and should be used first and foremost as money have been gaslighted, ridiculed, and silenced for the past year straight throughout this whole entire thing. We've been called crazy, and people saying we don't understand anything about how the network works, that you don't know anything about code, you shouldn't be commenting, you don't even have a right to an opinion, all kinds of things. I mean, it was next level. I'm talking like just intelligence agency level gaslighting and manipulation tactics have gone throughout this entire thing. And there's just no reason for that, because we can run whatever node software we want. And the Bitcoin Commons at thebitcoincommons.org is really the most important project in the space right now, I think, if you ask me. I'll put links to my recent podcast and video on that subject. I just had Gil Roberts and Josh, aka Secure Sovereign, on the podcast several weeks ago. Highly recommend you check that out if this subject interests you, which, if you're into Bitcoin, it definitely should. And if you're not running your own node yet, right now is definitely the time. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm somewhat ashamed to admit that I'm still running Core version 29 on my node, simply because I don't see any better option. You can argue Knots is better, and I tend to agree with that argument for the most part, but it's still 95% Core. It's just a fork of Core, and it allows you to put some filters in, sure, but Core is basically maintained by three guys. Josh, Secure Sovereign, after he did a deep dive into the governance structure, he discovered most pull requests are approved by about three people. Well, with Knots, it's really just one person who manages the code, so I don't see it as that much of an improvement. I guess if your only concern is filtering the transactions you don't want, then it is a better option. But for me, given what I know, the option I'm going with is just running an older version of Core until the Bitcoin Commons is available, widely publicly available and tested, which should happen sometime in the next 12 months. And then I plan to switch over to that and have just a very lean type of node that just allows for the monetary transactions. And it's really been just a fascinating thing to see. I mean, it's hard to comprehend how swiftly all of this happened, how these outside interests just came in and more or less took over a major portion of the Bitcoin network. I mean, that's what happened. They somehow got to these core developers and influenced them, paid them off, or whatever happened to get them to make this change so that Citrea could come in and create this whole altcoin and ecosystem, just using Bitcoin's block space, which is a total betrayal and totally wrong, if you ask me. It's not something that we should just take laying down, not something anyone should stand for. I mean, it's completely unnecessary, just like the initial change was completely unnecessary. And A lot of people said at the time, this is just going to lead to all kinds of stuff on Bitcoin that is already happening on chains like Ethereum and Solana. So why not just go use Ethereum and Solana? And now that's entirely true. That's been proven true. That's the only silver lining of this whole thing, is that those of us who were, again, severely gaslighted, ridiculed, and manipulated into thinking we were wrong have now been proven right. And I'm sure there's all kinds of rhetoric out there saying why, oh, it's actually not the case. Like Jameson Lopp's statement of, well, Citrea doesn't actually use op return for that. It's just like a fail-safe thing for fraud or whatever. But I mean, come on, how can you listen to someone like that when they pushed the change through because they had a financial incentive to do so? The guy's a main investor in Citrea. So it's just so obvious. I mean, it doesn't get any more obvious. People are free to believe what they want. To me, it looks like there's only one possibility in terms of what's going on here. And there's only one thing to do about it, which is run your own node. If you have the resources to do so, get into mining too. Run your own miners, as much hash rate as you can muster. If you have solar panels on your home or access to cheap energy in whatever way that may be, go ahead and start mining, or at least get a little Bitaxe miner. I have one. It does about 1 terahash a second, I think, give or take. And that's not very much by today's standards, but it's better than nothing. And if everyone ran their own node and at least one little Bitaxe home miner, that changes the picture significantly. If everyone who holds any amount of Bitcoin, rather, were to do that, it does take some of the power back from these centralized developers and corporate interests. I don't know what else to call it, but it's a dangerous direction that we're heading in. I think that's what I want to close with, is if everyone in the community just stands around and lets that happen, which is not what's happening, to be fair. There's a lot of people pushing back against this in many ways. But if everyone were to just sit back and not do anything about it, then we would be in big trouble and Bitcoin would eventually die. I could say that with 100% certainty. If stuff like that keeps happening so dramatically, so swiftly, then there'd be no end to what could happen to Bitcoin. Thankfully, measures are already being taken. We can all contribute in our own ways. Me making this video is part of what I can do in addition to running a node. And I want to thank you, everyone who's watching, because that first video was the first one of mine that really blew up. It got like 1,000 views when I had less than 10 subscribers, I think, and I was blown away from the response. And that was what motivated me to keep making more YouTube videos, just the positive feedback on there. So if you're still watching this, I really appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next video. And I want to thank you, everyone who's watching, because that first video was the first one of mine that really blew up. It got like 1,000 views when I had less than 10 subscribers, I think, and I was blown away from the response. And that was what motivated me to keep making more YouTube videos, just the positive feedback on there. So if you're still watching this, I really appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next video.